at our wonderful expo next week. So thank you for joining us and glad you're here. And just so you know, we will be recording this so that other people can watch it later, and we'll put it up on our website and in our Canvas shell for everyone who's getting ready for Expo. So even if you do for some reason have to leave early or something like that, we will be recording it for posterity. So thank you all again all for joining us and having our second official undergraduate research workshop via Zoom. And today we have two wonderful talks presenting on how to do a great presentation. And they have the material specifically for the virtual expos. We're very grateful for that. So we have Dr. Bill Ryan and Dr. Lisa Roberts. Thank you so much for joining us and
Gareth.
Being adaptable and joining us in this environment.
Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, that's.
All right, we good? All right, so I think Bill and Lisa, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, I think you can join our conversation and start the proceedings. Thank you so much.
Sure. Hi, I'll just introduce myself, and then Lisa, you guys can introduce yourself too. I'm a biologist, a postdoc in the biology department here at UAB. And so the talk we're going to give you today is it can be useful for anybody that's giving data talk, including with data. But hopefully, some of the themes that we'll use you can pull out for regardless of what subject you're giving. So Lisa, do you want to?
I'm Lisa. I'm a postdoc in the Department of Medicine. I do aging research, so really how we can keep people who are aging functional for as long as possible. And I'm excited to talk about this topic. I know that Will and I have talked about presentations before, and we both are pretty passionate about effectively presenting, so I think this should be good.
All right, so I'll go ahead and share my PowerPoint here. And so we'll go through it first and just sort of talk about kind of elements of giving a good presentation. And then at the end, we'll talk about some strategies for using recording software and kind of what your different options are for creating a video as opposed to just giving a presentation. I'll go ahead and share this. Take me a second. Okay, how does that look for everybody?
Good.
Okay, and so I, first of all, just would like to acknowledge that there's always a little bit of awkwardness in coming to give a presentation about giving good presentations, because you sort of set yourself up as an expert and then immediately, are put to the test in giving a good presentation. So an ounce of humility is good for anybody getting up in front of other people to talk about their work. But hopefully what you're trying to do when you're conveying, when you're giving a presentation about work that you've been doing, is this is an opportunity to talk about something that hopefully you're excited about and you're passionate about. And so you want to bring that passion with you to your presentation. And so professionalism is good, but you also want to try and let your passion shine through most of all. And so first we'll just start off with, what is a research talk and what isn't a research talk? So a research talk or a presentation based on your research is a story that's supported by data, right? We don't want to have this be a list of facts or a deep dive into the minutia of everything that you've learned. You want to try to tell a good story and then use your data to support the key elements of that story. So it's a way to share new ideas and get good feedback from colleagues and from your audience. And then it's usually also about a work in progress. And so whatever level you're presenting at, whether it's undergraduate research or you're a scientist going to a conference, what have you, whatever level you're going to, usually you're going to present something that you're working on currently that's in a sort of an ongoing form, because this is the best way to get feedback from your peers so that you can make your work as good as possible. What is research? What is research talk not? It shouldn't be a narrative account of your experience doing research. So this is one of the things that we often find, especially with new scholars that are just starting out, is that the way that people construct the order of their talk is the order in which they learn the things that they're talking about. And sometimes, you know, the path that you take getting to your findings can be sort of a winding, idiosyncratic path. And while that makes for a really good, fun story to tell people, oftentimes you don't have enough time to go through that whole talk. So I know the talks that you're going to be presenting are going to be 5 to 10 minutes. And so you really want to think about how to organize the information that you're going to offer in a way that's going to allow people to get the conclusion you want them to get to in the most sort of efficient way possible. And so it's not going to be, you know, we thought this and then we tried this and it didn't work and then we tried this other thing. You want to just sort of think like a teacher and think about what the best way to explain the conclusion is and how to support that. It's also not a deep dive into the details. So if you've done something complicated, particularly if you've done a lot of statistical analysis or you've learned some very complicated method, now is not really the time to show off that, you know, that knowledge and that depth that you have. Again, what you want to do for your audience is to try to bring them into the work that you're doing, find the most interesting points and come with you to the conclusions, and allow them to come up with questions that they can talk to you about afterwards, or they can email you about afterwards if they want to know more about all of the specifics that you really did. Because most of the time the audience that you're talking to is going to take away your conclusions and doesn't have the background knowledge to really delve into the details with you. And so you want to just bring them in on the best parts of your story. And then it's also not a lecture, right? And so oftentimes you're talking about novel findings or you're talking about something that you've done. And so you don't have to give the whole history of the idea that you're talking about, especially in a 5 to 10 minute talk. You really just want to get in and tell your audience what the coolest part that you found is. And so the basic structure of a research talk is going to be similar no matter what length of talk you're going to give. And so I realized as I was just starting on here that I have the timings on here for about a 15-minute talk. And so you're not going to want to follow these timings exactly, but the structure is going to be similar. And so you're going to want to use this sort of format where you bring people in by asking a big question, you give them some background information, let them know what your specific hypotheses are, and then what you did, what you found, and what it means. And then if you have time left at the end, kind of expand back out and think about what you would do in the future, and then of course acknowledge the people that helped you along the way. And so you can think about, so again, just ignore these timings for right now, but what I want you to think about as you're shaping your story is to think about what's called the hourglass model of information. And so it's essentially talking about how you want to start off broad with a big question that will engage your audience, recognizing that your audience doesn't have specific background in what you're talking about. And so you start off broad, and then you start to add more details to your story to help your audience go with you from the broad question that everybody can understand all the way down to the very specific piece of that question that you addressed. And so that's, you know, you have to bring people in from a broad question down to your narrow question, and then you can tell them your specific hypotheses, methods, and results of what you did, right? And you can give them enough information to follow along that story. And then at the end, you want to gently let people back out into the bigger, broader world, right? And so you summarize your results and try and connect the thing that you found in your specific research back out to that broad kind of question that everybody can grab onto. And so this is just a really nice way to sort of gently bring your audience with you so that you don't immediately jump into a lot of details that are going to smack people in the face and help them, you know, not help them stay engaged in your talk. And your job will be a little more difficult in a 5 to 10 minute talk because you have to sort of cover all of this ground in the most efficient way possible. Yeah, and so for your big questions in your background, right, you want to connect your work to ideas that your audience is already familiar with. And then you want to use this section to build an argument, right? And so a lot of times an effective way to use a background is to say, well, the question that we have, you know, is this broad question, and we know this, we know this, we know this, therefore, this is what we want to ask, right? You're kind of building an argument to justify why your hypothesis is interesting and worth working toward. You only provide the essential information, and then you want to assume that your audience is intelligent but not knowledgeable, right? And so you don't want to talk down to them and assume that they know nothing, but you want to treat them like just intelligent people that are just happen to not be informed about your specific topic, and that you're there to help them gain that specific knowledge in 5 to 10 minutes, right? And with the specific hypotheses, the goal is to make a specific prediction. So this is particularly relevant for a scientific talk. In some other fields, you may have a different convention for how to present this section of the talk. But usually you want to sort of set up some predictions that you can then test whatever you did against. And you want to make sure that the predictions that you give, or the hypotheses that you give, or the questions that you're asking in your talk can be satisfactorily answered with the data that you present. So you don't want to try to, make a prediction or have a hypothesis be, so broad and so general that when you finally learn your specific data or your specific conclusion, that it's sort of unsatisfying. So you want to ask people a good question and then provide them a good answer. And again, when you get into your methods, particularly in a short talk, right, the goal is to just give enough detail so that somebody has a general understanding of what you did, but without going into all of the gory detail of all of the work that you did have to do. I know when you're first starting out and you give a talk, sometimes it feels, like you did a whole bunch of work and then you don't get credit for it because in the talk you say, maybe 1 or 2 sentences about all of that different work that you did. But that's just the way of it, is that if people are interested, they'll come talk to you, and then they'll want to know all of those details about everything you did. And so the approach here is to keep it simple and try to keep it organized. If you have a way of making a diagram or a picture to describe what it is that you did, that's going to be better than words every time. And again, you can't assume that your audience is familiar with methods. And so if you're working in the School of Medicine or something, and you're always talking to other people who are either in your lab or in your field, and then you go to share your research in a general audience, with a general audience like you'll have for the expo, oftentimes it's hard to distinguish what is common knowledge among people and what is very specific to your field. And so it's worth trying to talk about your research with people outside of your field to understand what's general knowledge and what's specific to your environment. And then often, the work that you do to prepare for your talk is you prepare much more detailed explanations for everything, and then you try to distill it down to just the very simple basics, so that if somebody does have a follow-up question, that you have that complex answer that you can talk to them about. Okay, when you're talking about the results of your study or what you found, again, the goal is to have that fine balance where you've given enough information so that people understand what you did without overwhelming people with every idea that you had out of your study. And so keep it simple, focus on just 2 to 3 main points, and limit the detail, right? The few people in your audience who get really excited about what you're doing will follow up with you and ask those more complex questions. And you want to try to select figures and graphs or pictures or whatever your sort of most visually stimulating media is to convey your points, to really focus, have a purpose for every image that you show, so that you're guiding people's attention through your presentation. And to talk a little bit more about presenting data in a meaningful way. So a lot of people will be presenting some sort of data that they've collected. And so you want to think really hard about how to create a graph that's going to just convey the information that you're going to talk about and doesn't overwhelm people with too much information. And then as you go to actually present it, there's sort of a method of bringing people into your figure so that you can have them be oriented to what's going on in the figure before you give them the conclusion, right? And so in this case, this is sort of a generic graph, but you can give a title at the top, right, that says what the conclusion of this graph, right? Variable X has a positive correlation with variable Y, but the slope depends on some treatment. right? And so somebody can either look at your graph and try to understand your graph, or they can just read this simple sentence that tells them exactly what's being described in this graph. And so you give people 2 entry points into this information. And when you first put a graph up, you click onto the slide that has some sort of data, you want to take a second and orient people to the graph before you just launch into what the conclusion was. And so if I put this graph up in a presentation, I would say, well, first I'd like you to see that I have variable X and it's in this unit on the X-axis, right? And then I'm comparing that to variable Y. And what you can see is that these 2 different colored lines represent 2 different treatments that I did on, in this experiment. And as you can see, as variable X increases, variable Y also increases, right? We have this very nice correlation, but there's a little bit of a difference in the slope of how the red line and the black line, which represent the 2 different treatments, change with variable X, right? And so you bring people in, spend the time to orient them to the graph so that when you get to that, and so here's what it means, they all are with you and have followed your whole story. All right, so that simple explanatory title, clear axis labels with units, points that are easy to distinguish, right? Your figure should be large enough that people can actually see what's going on. A key explaining any colors. And so if there are things that are in different colors or different point types or something on your graph that don't mean anything, or you're not gonna make a big deal about them, try to make a figure that doesn't have any of that extra information in it because it's just distracting. And then finally, if you are going to present some sort of statistics, give it in the simplest possible form, right? And you can work with your mentors or work with other people to try and figure out what is the minimum amount of information that you can give that still conveys your point, right? Because that's the goal here. And so finally, when you've gotten through that section and you want to give a little bit about the meaning of your findings and the future directions, right, you can briefly summarize those key results because you will have just gone through, the most complicated part of your talk. And so help people out by summarizing in 1 or 2 sentences, what is the main point that you found, and what should they walk away remembering about your talk. And then you always, if you've offered a hypothesis at the beginning, you always want to state the result for that hypothesis again, right? Try to not make people make too many connections for themselves. They're listening to your story, and so you want to tell them the end of your story. And then you can try to connect specific results, so your specific experiment, to the broader questions in your field, right? So why would I do this electrophysiology? Well, in my field, this is the big question that we have, and this is how my finding connects to that big question and helps us further the field, right? And so you can try to mirror the information you provided in your background section, right? So if you made this argument in your background section to try and get you to the specific hypothesis, then in the results, you want to return back to all of that same information and explain how what you found changes the way that you think about that background information. Clearly state the fate of the hypothesis, and then remind us why your work was important, right? How it's changed our understanding of whatever your big question was. So what is your work contributing to the larger field, and how can your audience think differently about the way the world works because of the work that you've done? And so now we're going to switch over and give an example. So this is sort of, I've been talking about kind of the structure of the talk, but now we're going to talk a little bit about the aesthetics of a talk and about giving a good presentation. And so what I want you to do over this next part, I'm going to throw it over to Lisa, and she's going to give you an example of a talk. And as she's giving her presentation, I want you to think about the elements of her presentation. So you can think about how her slides are laid out, her use of color, her use of fonts, the amount of text that's on her slides, and the graphics that she chose, so that you can kind of evaluate, what is effective in her presentation and what is not effective. And then also, as she's speaking, what is effective in the way that she's presenting information, and are you walking away with an understanding of the content that she's trying to convey? And then we'll come back at the end and we will talk a little bit amongst ourselves about what we saw in her talk and what we think might be able to be improved or what we liked. And so this is the good, bad, and ugly part. Okay, so Lisa.
All right, so I'm going to now share my screen. Do you guys see just a black screen?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I'm going to talk to you guys today about motor unit adaptations with age. Okay. So, I don't really know what this green line is, but we're just going to kind of ignore that. Maybe it'll go away. So we have a spinal cord, and out of the spinal cord are these two little ends that allow for nerves to pass through. And then we also have muscle. And in these muscles, we have individual fibers.
It's so pretty. I took a good picture.
Excuse me. Sorry. And so we have this muscle fiber, or this muscle that has fibers within each little bundle. And each of these fibers is connected to a nerve that comes from our spinal cord, and it creates these clumpings. If you see here, there's clumpings of different colors, and those clumpings are what we call motor units. Okay? And, oh, that's okay. We now know that's a nerve. That was a motor unit nerve. So back to our fibers and our motor units. So when we age, you have death of individual muscle fibers. And when that happens, you lose a muscle fiber. And you can think about what that would actually mean is they would lose strength potentially, or lose function of different muscles. But actually what can happen, well, and that's bad. But actually what can happen is that fiber can then be rescued by a neighboring motor unit, and it changes to a different motor unit. And in that case, we don't have cell death. It lives, which is really exciting. And that's what we found in my study, and you see this because I have data. So that was my research presentation on skeletal muscle adaptations with age. So let's talk about all of those things that Will mentioned right before I gave that presentation. So things to consider. So my slide layout, my use of color, my fonts, text, and graphics. Okay, so slide layout was pretty simple. There wasn't much layout. Everything was right in the middle. But what about my use of color? Did anyone notice anything with the color used?
It was bad.
It was bad, but it was
like all merged together.
I did green and I did gold, and those are the UAB official colors to use on their presentation. So I was being school spirited. What's wrong with that?
Look bad.
It created this terrible dynamic between the background, which that bright yellow is very abusive to your eyes, but then also with the colors on top of that, they didn't show up as well. And so that's something to consider, is the use of your background color. In general, backgrounds being as plain as possible, black or white, is going to probably be your best option. And if you want to put a school affiliation, you can do that with the slides that UAB has some actually already put together, or you can do a little emblem in the bottom corner so it's not distracting. But I would shy away from using bright colors as a background color. What about my use of fonts? Was there any font or text? I had zero text. And what I did have that was words was actually handwritten, and not handwritten very well. Okay, so that's something to consider also. You've probably heard at some point in time to not use too much text, to be careful of using too much text. And that's very important. You don't want to have paragraphs, but you also need to be careful that you actually do put some text in, because text does serve a purpose. It helps the reader understand what's going on with your slide, even if they might have missed something that you said. It orients them to the information that you are saying, which can be very beneficial. As for graphics, did you guys notice anything about my graphics, which was essentially the entire presentation? Were they helpful?
No.
I would agree. I would say they weren't very helpful. They were drawn, which can be a good use of graphics if it's designed to actually aid in understanding. But otherwise, it was actually just because I found a new tool and I wanted to use this cool new tool because we have all this technology and I'm giving this virtual presentation so I can use it. So I did, and it didn't add anything to my presentation. If we talk about the presentation style, so that's a little different when it's not in person anymore. But did you guys notice anything about my actual style of presenting?
You looked to the side quite a bit. You weren't looking directly at the camera, addressing the people.
So the way that my setup is I have 2 monitors, and I have my main monitor that has my camera on it, which is where I'm looking now, and my second monitor, which is over here. And if I look at that monitor, it's helpful for me because I know what I'm talking about. But for anyone watching that presentation, I've immediately lost engagement, which if you're doing a virtual presentation, that is such an important factor. If you can see your face, then you need to be engaging with the audience in some way, okay? But what else? So again, I'm in my home right now. Did anything else come up that was maybe noticed?
Someone interrupted you.
My husband came over and interrupted me because he wanted to show whatever. It doesn't matter why. But that's something else to be very cognizant of, is your surroundings. So you guys will be recording these presentations, which is great because that means if something happens, you can just start back over and it's not live. But make sure that when you do record it, you're in a quiet, private space and you're not distracted by something else. So even if he hadn't have interrupted me and I just would have noticed, maybe one of my dogs did something different, that can throw me off and distract me, which can take away from the actual presentation. So those are things to consider as you're recording that for your actual virtual presentation, okay? In terms of tips for slide layout, so in general, minimize clutter. What's on your slide, every piece of information, every picture, every graphic should serve some type of a purpose, okay? You wanna make sure that what everyone sees, they're meant to see. So the slides that I had one green line, it was just out of time with the graphic. Well, that was very distracting if you didn't know what it was for. And even if I wasn't expecting that. So make sure that you're looking through your slides, that everything that you have is meant to be there and it's all serving some type of purpose. And when it's all there together, it looks clean, it looks professional. Also, organize the information to steer the audience's attention. So everything that should be there in a way where your audience is following what you're saying. So if you use graphics, they can be very beneficial and they can help you tell your story more effectively, but they should help guide your audience to what it is you're trying to say and not just be there because it's a cool tool that you can use. And then use color to highlight information. Don't use color just because it's available. Color should be used so that way someone can see something they're meant to see. So I love this picture because you obviously see this red apple in a sea of black and white apples, and you're meant to be looking at the red apple. Also with the use of color, pay attention to high contrast colors. So my background slides were bright green and bright yellow. That's very kind of painful to look at. And so you want to have your information on either a dark slide or on a light slide. That also helps with your contrast, so that way you can always see the words that you're putting or the images that you're using. Also pay attention to color blindness. This is a really, really simple Google for color blindness, or you can actually just go to the website where it shows you the colors that you shouldn't pair together, because people who are colorblind won't be able to differentiate between what it is you're talking about. And so automatically that slide is no longer effective for those individuals. And then how you use text over the background. So pictures can be used as background, or you can have text over a picture. If that's illustrating your point, it can be very beneficial and useful. But if you can't actually read what that text is saying, then it's never helpful. So if you look at this picture right here, it says on the top, text over photographs can be hard to read. And that's a white over a cloudy picture, and so you lose that white text. And on the bottom, it's black over the field, and it says the exact same thing, but because of the shadows in the picture, again, you lose that text. You can play with how opaque a picture is in order to actually see this if you feel like it's really important that an image has text overlaid on it. When we look at fonts, pick fonts that are easy to read. So typically for a presentation, a sans serif font will be the easiest because it's really easy to see from far away. In a virtual world, the depth isn't as big of an issue, but if you're thinking about if you were to give a presentation in front of people, the sans serif fonts can be used really well. But the serif fonts can also be effective. That's a little bit more of a style thing. But I would definitely shy away from any fun fonts. Those are typically just distracting. And then also your actual font size through your presentation. So you can see a very big difference through the different font sizes on these and how big they show in your slide. And if your font's too small on your slide, again, if you were in person and you're far away, it's hard to see. On the computer, it's a little bit easier, so that can be okay, but you don't want people having to squint at your slides to see what it is you're talking about. And then also avoid too much text. Paragraphs on a slide are just distracting for the audience. Automatically, you want to read the paragraph, and as soon as you start reading, you stop listening to what someone's saying. So your audience is no longer paying attention to you and what you're saying. They're just reading what's on your slide. So when it comes to graphics, graphics are fantastic. If you can use a graphic to explain a concept instead of words, that's almost always a better option because it doesn't distract the audience member. They don't have to focus on reading. They can actually see what you're explaining. But make sure that they have a very clear purpose. Again, don't just have a picture because it exists. And then present simple graphs and orient your audience to your graphs. So on that last presentation, I had a graph at the end, but I didn't tell you anything about the graph. I didn't explain how that graph related to anything else I talked about. It was just there. But make sure that you're orienting people to your graphs. This is exactly like Will said, and that you're using simple graphs. If you look at these two graphs, the one on the left has all of these dots, and it's cool, and it might have a lot of information, but I'm looking at it right now, and I'm thinking, I don't know what that graph is supposed to tell me, except there's a lot of dots everywhere. Whereas the one on, I'm sorry, that was the one on the right. The one on the left is much more simple. You have two very distinct lines. I can tell right away red and blue are different. In terms of your style, try not to have a scripted speech. Definitely practice your speech, and you should know what you're wanting to say. But overly scripted presentations are very dull, and it can be hard for someone to pay attention to that. So you want to try to not have a super scripted speech, know your information, and then what you say will be accurate. Minimize your filler words. So try to not say, like, you know, we all do these in conversation. They are a natural part of our speech. And so if you slip up and it's there, that's fine. Just try not to make that a constant occurrence. And because you guys are going to be using a recording, you'll actually be able to watch your recording and see how often do you use a filler word? Are you comfortable with the material, or do you have to keep using filler words in order to continue going forward? Practice keeping your hands calm. I don't know if you notice, I talk with my hands. They're at the bottom of the screen, so sometimes you might see them, sometimes you don't. This is actually something I have to work very hard on because it's my natural way to talk. With a recorded session, I can kind of keep them low, and maybe I'm talking with my hands and you can't tell as much. But in general, hands can be very distracting. If I'm up here and I'm trying to talk about a concept, or I'm pointing, but I'm pointing to my monitor over there and it doesn't make any sense to you what I'm pointing at. Again, it's just distracting for the audience. So this, again, is not necessarily as applicable to a virtual presentation, but it's good practice to practice standing straight and not leaning on things. But if you transition that to a virtual presentation, try to make sure that you're sitting up tall, or if you're recording yourself standing, that you're standing up tall. I didn't do this, but I could have given my presentation all leaned back, and I'm more comfortable now. And maybe you can't tell super that I'm leaned back, but it's easier for me to fidget this way. It's easier for me to get distracted. Now you can see my hand movements a lot more. It's just important that you pay attention and that you're more alert with things like that. So sit up tall or stand up tall, depending on what your situation is. Practice pausing to breathe. So again, this is one that I have to practice and that I work on, because when I get excited about material, I start talking fast. That doesn't actually help an audience pay attention to what I'm saying. So practice taking pauses. It might seem unnatural to you. It might seem like dead space and silence, but in general, to other people, they don't notice the dead space unless it's for over 30 seconds, maybe they'll notice. But a general pause in conversation for just a breath is not normally noticed. Okay. So I'm going to go back to that presentation that I just gave, and I'm going to give you the version that I would give if I were actually trying to give this information in a more professional manner. Okay.
I have a question first.
Oh, sorry.
So does anybody remember, or can anybody summarize what the point of Lisa's talk was before? What was the big takeaway?
That the nerves, like the motor nerves, can transfer and not regenerate, but like.
But something. The nerves do
something around the motor unit.
There are
Which-
like different functions, and they can switch to a different function instead of dying.
Yeah, so you guys actually did a decent job of knowing what the point was, but it wasn't very specific because I didn't explain it very specifically, which meant you probably didn't actually learn the concept, which is the point of it. Will, did you have anything else before I?
No, I just kind of wanted to have the comparison of what we got out of your talk prior to, with the first presentation versus what we might take away from this one.
Yes. So for my second presentation, I'm actually going to shift my setup so that way it's easier for me to pay attention to what I'm showing you and also have you straight ahead. So that way I can see what I'm talking about, and I'm also still looking at the camera, so it's not distracting in that manner. So those are things to keep in mind as you're recording a presentation. Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you guys about what happens to motor units when people age. So my background, I'm going to first explain what skeletal muscle anatomy generally looks like. So we have this great skeletal muscle bundle of fibers, and you can see we have a muscle that's encasing a whole bunch of small little fibers, and that's what these little dots right here are. So if we look at one of these fibers or a grouping of these fibers closer, we can see how they actually attach to motor units. So from our spinal cord, we have our cell bodies of the nerves that extend out, and they join together with various muscle fibers. And these muscle fibers that all join together with one motor neuron or motor nerve all create one motor unit. And they're all part of the exact same motor unit. And so here in this slide, I'm showing two different motor units, and they both have multiple muscle fibers within them, okay? But if we talk about what happens with age, what my lab looked at was actually, with age, does the organization of these motor units change? And so again, we have the same motor units. We have our two groupings, so our green group and our red group. And if you look at young, healthy muscle fibers, you can see the grouping between them, you have this really pretty mosaic. And so we have both red and green fibers, and they're kind of interspersed with each other. But then if we look at older muscle, you can see there's a lot more of these red groupings together, and they're less interspersed amongst the green fibers. So what we propose is happening with that is that as muscle ages, you have this motor neuron cell death. And from that, you can have a death of a muscle fiber. But instead, what we actually see is that those muscle fibers are rescued by surrounding motor neurons, and then they become a part of a different motor unit group. And it creates this larger motor unit group than what it used to be, and more of a grouping effect, where we see larger numbers of these red muscle fibers together, where the green fibers aren't innervating them or aren't interspersed amongst them. And so if we look at what that data actually looks like in terms of the number of muscle fibers or myofibers within a group between young adults and old adults, you can see that on our x-axis here, we have our young adults, and our older adults. And we have the grouping size. So the average number of muscle fibers within a group of a motor unit or within a group surrounding each other. And you can see that there's a pretty big difference between how there's larger groupings of muscle fibers in this older adult group compared to our younger adults. Thank you. So what were some differences with that presentation compared to the first presentation? Nothing. They were the exact same.
Well, for one, the graph at the end, like we actually know what it is now.
Yeah, I explained the graph at the end. I showed what that data actually was supposed to be talking about and how it supported what I had already previously been talking about. What about my use of graphics in this presentation compared to the other? Are there any differences with my graphics?
It was a lot more clear, and as each like little graphic popped up, it like moved with your speech.
Yeah.
Colors within your graphic, so you can just direct your audience attention to the color, which is what you're trying to say. So it's a lot more clear than the previous one.
Yeah, so my colors were serving a purpose this time, where I actually explained the differences between those two colors, and I showed another photo that actually made those colors make more sense, which made my data make more sense. And the graphics this time, they were not graphics that I hand drew. They were actual images from textbooks to help show a concept in a much more professional way and in a way that actually helps you see what the picture is supposed to be if you've never seen it before. Yeah.
I'm just going to add that you obviously knew the material very well, that at times you even used more high-tech terms, shall we say, but then you explained them for the layman like me so that I had a better understanding of it. So even when maybe you fell back into some of that terminology that was more specific, you were still able then quickly translate it for a normal audience. So that was excellent.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So I guess our next part is talking more about just this virtual world of presentations. So I think that everyone has the same resource with the links to how you get like closed captions. Is that correct, Gareth? Yeah. So I would absolutely use those, partially because it's a requirement, but also it's a software doing it for you, and then you can edit it. So closed captions are hugely beneficial for virtual presentations because they help it be accessible for every individual. Okay. Will, did you have specific things you wanted to talk about?
I was just going to talk a little bit about what your different options are for recording presentation. And so you can, the sort of simplest format to do is just to record your voice talking through PowerPoint. And so if you go into PowerPoint and go into the slideshow options, there's an option there that just says record. And you can, if you record, it'll open up your presentation to the beginning, and then you can just record with your computer microphone as you're flipping through the slides. And then at the end, you're able to go to the file and save your file as a PowerPoint show, and it'll put out basically a video, a compiled video that has the slides flipping through and your voice being recorded. But I would encourage you to explore some of the other options that give you a little bit more control. First of all, because the sound quality for some reason in the PowerPoint recording is very bad. So it's like listening to an old telephone. And the other thing is that with the PowerPoint recording, you don't get to see your face presenting. And as you might have imagined, since we're all in the Zoom world, it's a lot easier to stay engaged listening to somebody talk when they can see your face and they can kind of get a bit of your personality rather than just hearing your voice. And so one option that you have to record with a video, if you have a webcam, is to actually just use Zoom, which is how a lot of us have sort of learned how to do lectures now, recording lectures. And so in Zoom, you can actually just go up and click record, and then it'll record your video, and after you close down a meeting, it'll output a video of that. And then within the Zoom software, you can actually edit the video, so you can trim, you know, if you didn't start talking the way you wanted to right at the beginning, or you had a little bit of awkwardness at the end when you were trying to find the leave the meeting button, you can actually have a little bit of editing there, and you can make some choices about how large your little floating head is relative to the slides and that sort of thing. And so there's a lot of, you can figure it out just by clicking around and kind of trying some things out, but there's a bunch of different modes that you can try out with Zoom, and there's a lot of online resources for that. And then there's also the option of going through the UAB software for Kaltura. And so Kaltura will also allow you to record your slides with audio and with video. And so I don't know if Gareth, if you have more advice on that front. So I've never used Kaltura, but oh, your audio is off.
There, I am muted. Sorry, I was answering some questions that were happening in chat, which is great. If you have questions, please post them on chat, and I'll be answering them as quickly as I can. And unfortunately, as I was listening, I only caught the tail end of that, Will. But yes, Kaltura, there are a lot of wonderful tutorials there, and e-learning has their hotline that you can email them, that they can address issues. You can send them to me as well, ghjones@uab.edu, and I'll try to walk you through them or get you connected with someone who can. So if you're having any technical issues, that's why you have, you know, these 5 or 6 days now to be able to address that. So if you have any issues, we want to find out now. You know, test it, and if there's an issue, let us know, and we'll help you out.
One other thing that I would say is easy with Zoom is you just share your screen, and then you can go through your presentation that way with it recorded. So it just looks like your slides with your little picture on the side, and it's all seamless. But if you don't have a webcam and you want a different option for a microphone, but instead of using Zoom where it's going to have a black box with just your name in it, one thing that you can do is, if you have a Mac, I know how to do it on a Mac, but I feel like PC also has something like it where it's a screen record, and your computer just records your screen. So you can have it record your screen while you're presenting a PowerPoint, and it'll pick up with its microphone on the computer your voice, and it'll just voice it over, and you'll end up with this video file that has you flipping through slides, but also speaking over them. If you didn't have a webcam, or if you weren't wanting to use the webcam option, the computer microphone, it works a little better that way outside of PowerPoint than embedded within PowerPoint. So that's also another option. And like I said, I don't know exactly how to do it on a PC. I know Macs are capable. I assume PCs are also.
Does anybody have any questions for us, either about presenting or about the recording aspect of it?
One like kind of general question I have is like, since it's gonna be a little different since it's online now, but like, how do y'all like deal with pre-presentation anxiety?
So I'm going to give you a couple tips that I got when I first started presenting that I still fall back on. If for some reason I'm overly excited, a lot of times excitement can come across as nerves as well. And that's actually probably one of my biggest pitfalls, is I get too excited, makes it seem like I'm really nervous, and that's not it. But one of the best pieces of advice I ever received was have a beverage close by. Because if you get too excited, if you think that you're speaking too fast, you pause to take a drink, it slows you down immediately, and you have to slow down because you have to swallow your water, and then you set it down, and automatically you can reset. It also gives you an allowance for a expected break where you don't feel weird with a pause, because everyone can see that you're taking a drink. It's a justifiable pause. If you don't feel as comfortable as you're talking about your research in the middle of a slide, just taking a pause for a breath, it's a really good crutch to fall on. Just be careful that you don't overly use it, because then it's distracting. That's one thing. The other thing is practice, but don't practice with a script. Practice without a script and just learn the material, and then you'll be able to say exactly what you want to say, and it might be a little different every time, but it'll be more natural to you.
So one trick that kind of goes along with that is that, so I used to have a problem, like I've done this a lot, so I've gotten more comfortable now, but I used to have the problem where as soon as you step up there and you have a slide behind you, your mind goes blank. And so it makes it really hard to kind of be, in person and do that unscripted sort of presentation. And so one trick is to have just a little starter phrase that you do memorize for either each slide, or especially that first slide of your presentation. Memorize the first 2 sentences that you want to say to get you off and running. Because oftentimes if you can do that by memorization, then just being able to stand up there and spit out the first couple of sentences will get you off and running, and then you'll be able to, your brain will just kind of kick in and carry you. And so it's a nice little trick to kind of blend that memorization versus being in person kind of present.
And actually, also going off of that, your slide should be prompts for you, the information on your slide. So if you have a bullet point, it's to remind you to say a point because you wanted to talk about it. So format your slides in a way that it's easiest for you to remember and recall what you're wanting to say.
Yeah, the other nice thing in PowerPoints, especially because you're going to be recording a video, so you're going to be able to look at, if you use the presenter view, then you can have some notes for yourself at the bottom to help jog your memory if you feel like you start to get nervous or something. And it's like a little reassurance that, even if you get lost in your presentation, you can always just look down in those presenter notes and be reminded of where you're at. Yeah, and I would recommend for recording, because for whatever reason, having that little red light on recording you creates all kinds of anxiety. And so I would recommend running through your presentation in full as though it's, like a dress rehearsal a few times before you ever try to record it. Because even when I'm giving a lecture, when I started recording my lectures, it kind of like I got in my own head about it, and I had some trouble, doing my normal thing just because the little red light was on.
That was a great question. Any other questions?
I'm just making sure I got everyone's question answered in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and put my email in here too, so if anyone has any follow-up questions later that they think of, they have that.
I think one general piece of advice is that if you're working on something that you're excited about, then other people will be excited about it too. And they'll be excited with you, right? And so I think one of the things that makes you nervous with a presentation is, not knowing how people are going to respond to it, or not wanting to bore people, or, whatever. But you have to trust that if it's exciting enough for you to be excited about it, that other people will be excited with you. And just kind of lean into that feeling a little bit, because it helps you kind of have the confidence to just go up there and do it and embrace what you're doing.
And you may have talked about this already. I just want to add that if you have people that you can share it with beforehand, practice it with them, just as you would, in real life, in a normal circumstance. You can still definitely connect with people that way. And, you can share a recording with someone else as well. I know I've got a couple students in my class, for example, who are here today. Feel free to send me what you're going to upload beforehand, and I'm happy to look at it and give you some feedback. That's a very helpful thing. Just have people listen to it, and other than yourself, who can tell you, hey, this is great, or you need to work on certain things. So that helps.
And especially if they don't have a background in the area, a lot of times that really helps. If you can have your mom understand exactly what you're talking about, you're probably explaining it very well.
Unless, of course, your mom is like a neurophysicist too, in which case, send it to somebody else.
Yes. I think that was pretty much all that we had. If you guys don't have any more questions.
All right. I just want to thank Lisa and Will. Fantastic job We really appreciate it. I love the examples that you gave. And again, we've recorded this, so we will put it up on the Canvas page as well as our website. My email there. I'm sure, you know, Dr. Ryan, Dr. Roberts also are willing to, you know, have follow-up questions if anyone has those. We're all here to help during this. So thank you all for tuning in today. Thank you, Abby, for coordinating it from your end. But again, thanks to everyone for making this happen. Thank you.
Sure, and remember to have fun.
Yes.
Yeah.
It'll be fun.
Sharing your work should always be fun. It's something you put effort into.
All right.
Absolutely. Thank you for having fun today. All right. We'll talk to you later.
Thank you.